we come to the end of 2016, the Brexit vote in Great Britain and the presidential election in the United States that Sir Roger was just talking about are being widely interpreted as regressive isolationist attempts to reject modernity. At their core, however, I believe that both are exercises in democracy, signaling not a retreat to the past, but rather proposing a new way forward. And the question now before us is how we are going to navigate it. To be clear, as a somewhat amateur historian of democracy, I do not consider a free system of government to be a panacea for all humanity's ills. Democracy is not omnipotent, all-powerful, or inevitable. As Winston Churchill famously remarked, many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. At the same time, it does not automatically follow that voters are stupid, gullible, and weak because they chose a different path than the one prescribed for them by their betters. The British and American elections both addressed issues of sovereignty and national identity as the electorates were asked if they wanted to succumb to the gravitational pull of the soft socialism emanating from Brussels and Washington, and accept a future of safe but inescapable mediocrity. In both cases, they said no, that being a Brit or an American still means something, even in our postmodern world of interconnected relativity. Opponents of this impulse automatically associate it with bigotry and xenophobia, but at its best, our identity rests on three interrelated foundation stones: liberty, the Judeo-Christian moral code, and the equal value of each individual, all of which are actually inclusive, not exclusive. Such things may seem hopelessly archaic to the academic and media elites, and of course, as fallible human beings, we fall short of the ideal. We should not, however, use that as an excuse to stop aspiring to the principles that have historically shaped our nations. We might do better to recognize that our respective populations may well be onto something if we can summon the will to robustly defend rather than apologize for the heritage that defines us. It will not be an easy task. As that far greater historian of democracy, Alexis de Tocqueville, wrote in 1835, that nothing is more prodigal of wonders than the art of being free is a truth that cannot be repeated too often. But nothing is harder than the apprenticeship of liberty. This is not true, he wrote, of despotism. Despotism often presents itself as the remedy for all ills suffered in the past. It is the upholder of justice, the champion of the oppressed, and the foundation of order. Nations lulled to sleep by the temporary prosperity to which despotism gives rise, and when they awake, they are miserable. In 2016, the voters of Great Britain and the United States sounded the alarm. It is now up to their new leaders on both sides of the pond to heed the call. That is then the challenge and the opportunity that faces Britain and America in the new year, which is also the theme of this conference. How do we enjoy the prodigal wonders of freedom without shirking the apprenticeship of liberty? We both know all too well that there are external enemies that are targeting our countries for precisely those principles our populations have just voted to defend. Those totalitarian and zealotous foes consider freedom and equality anathema, and it's not enough for them to just reject them. They feel compelled to eradicate them from the earth. A key battleground in this struggle is the legacy of Western culture, and the purpose of my paper is to point out that we don't need to help this enemy with their task through preemptive surrender. I'd like to begin by pointing out the danger presented by the prevailing sense that it is the height of bad manners for Westerners to unapologetically celebrate their culture. Then I'd like to look at 3 case studies from my work in progress on this topic that will examine the Western tradition through the visual record in the hopes that we can come closer to a serious and sober assessment of this heritage that will allow us to learn from it and build on it, not to voluntarily cede this field to our enemies. I find one episode from the beginning of this year the most effective illustration of the phenomenon of preemptive surrender. It occurred in January when the theoretically moderate president of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Hassan Rouhani, visited Italy. The purpose of this trip was to explore that possibility of expanded economic cooperation enabled by the so-called Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, that went into effect under the auspices of the United Nations Security Council in July of 2015. Mr. Rouhani had an audience with Pope Francis, and he and his entourage inked some $22 billion in deals ranging from energy to shipbuilding. Mr. Rouhani was also invited to a state lunch hosted by Prime Minister Matteo Renzi in the famous Campidoglio Museum on the Capitoline Hill, where some of the greatest treasures of ancient Rome are displayed in buildings designed by Michelangelo. The Italian hosts were the model of accommodating protocol, as valiant efforts were made to make Mr. Rouhani feel as if he had never left Tehran. Some 2,500 years ago, however, this area in Rome was ground zero in the fight for freedom. According to the Roman historian Livy, sometime around the year 505, the virtuous noblewoman Lucrezia had been raped by the son of the Tarquin king of the city, and she killed herself rather than live with the shame. Her father and husband screamed in horror as they watched her sink to the ground, blood pouring out of the self-inflicted dagger wound in her chest. Her husband's best friend, however, kept his head. Striding forward, Brutus yanked the dagger from her body. "I swear," he shouted, "to expel Superbus Tarquin, his wife, and their disgusting offspring from Rome. By fire, iron, whatever means I have, our city shall have no more kings." Brutus seized the moment to depose the degenerate royal family to whom he was related through his mother and proclaim Rome a free state. This dramatic event became the catalyst behind the founding of the Roman Republic, which turned out to be the most durable attempt at democracy in the ancient world. It lasted centuries longer than that brief, albeit glorious, experiment in Athens, running from around 505 BC until the knives came out again for Julius Caesar on the Ides of March in 55 BC. Brutus had a rough time of it. Shortly after the Republic was established, his own sons plotted with their Tarquin cousins to restore the monarchy. When they were discovered, the boys assumed their father would save them, but he condemned them to a traitor's death, which they deserved. Then Brutus himself died, repelling the final attempt of the Tarquins to return to power. Through these ultimate acts of self-sacrifice, Brutus destroyed his family, but preserved the Republic. The Roman people were duly impressed and grateful. They erected an expensive bronze statue of the founder of the Republic in the act of making his pledge to rid Rome of tyrants on the Capitoline Hill, the civic and spiritual heart of the city. Some 2,000 years later, in the course of the Renaissance renovations of the Capitoline directed by Michelangelo, the head of a bronze statue was discovered, which was generally acclaimed as a fragment of the ancient portrait of Brutus that had once stood there. While the attribution is debated now, for centuries, and that's what you see on the far side of the screen, for centuries the bust was understood as that of the Republican hero and was bequeathed to the world's first public art museum that was organized on the Capitoline. This institution, in its history, its fabric, and its contents, thus constitutes sacred ground for the classical origins of Western civilization. Last January, this precious heritage was betrayed. In honor of Mr. Rouhani's visit, the modern-day government of Italy voluntarily censored its own culture, placing screens around the classical statues in the Capitoline Museum. They weren't just veiled, they were erased by plain white boxes. And in a final sad act of capitulation, the Italian Prime Minister banished that other great staple of the classical world and proud product of modern Italy, wine, from a state dinner to comply with Mr. Rouhani's Muslim faith. This wasn't a case of good manners. Good manners would be, when visiting a Muslim country, not insisting on drinking alcohol or dressing like a Kardashian. Good manners would have been Mr. Rouhani averting his own eyes from works of art he finds offensive and asking for a glass of water if he did not want to drink wine. This was no such thing. It was political correctness run amok, a pitiful attempt to curry favor with the leader of an authoritarian theocracy who now has lots of cash to spend. What happened last January in Rome was not, unfortunately, an isolated incident. It emblemizes the larger movement to discredit and delegitimize Western civilization as imperial, oppressive, and generally too big for its britches. We must, we are told time and time again, give all cultures equal billing and not impose our ideas and principles on others. Given what is perceived as the historically dominant position of the West, we must, in fact, accept a secondary place, lest we incommode the less fortunate. That all sounds very tolerant and progressive, but however well-intentioned, it has degenerated into a relentless exercise in self-flagellation in which we apologize for our own heritage to the very people whose stated goal is its destruction. In case that statement seems hyperbolic, especially in the context of the Obama administration's nuclear deal with Tehran, which theoretically improved relations between our countries, we should pay attention to what Mr. Rouhani's boss, the Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, has said about Western culture, and I quote, "In the current era, the Western world, with the use of advanced tools, is insisting on the cloning and replication of its culture on a global scale. I consider the imposition of Western culture on other peoples and the trivialization of independent forms of culture as a form of silent violence and extreme harmfulness." In other words, Mr. Khamenei views Western culture as, by its very existence, a sort of violent, harmful imposition. And this was not heated rhetoric from 1979. This letter was written shortly after the vicious attack on Paris in November of 2015, purportedly to explain to Western youth why it is their own fault that radical Islamic terrorists hate them and target them for violence. At the very least, the leaders of the West could stop tacitly condoning the views of the regime in Tehran by the sort of voluntary self-censorship that took place in Rome. In an ideal world, such statements would be met with an equally aggressive rebuttal, led by the United States and Great Britain, that affirms the value of Western civilization and blames the terrorists, not their victims, for the violence. The visit of the Iranian president could have been an opportune moment to reaffirm the great achievements of the generations of imperfect individuals who have aspired to the ideals of liberty and excellence. The story of what happened on the Capitoline so many years ago is not just a quaint legend, and the objects housed in that museum are not simply ancient curiosities. They are the building blocks of what became the tradition of liberal Western democracy. Our founding fathers invoked the example of Brutus when they set about establishing the first republic in the New World, and like the ancient Athenians and Romans, they fiercely believed that their arduous efforts to possess freedom set them apart. A key component in my effort to rehabilitate this heritage is to reintegrate the fine arts into how we study it. Art history has been a little noticed victim in the culture wars, as the very concept of a Western art survey has been widely reviled and mocked, while resources and honors have been heaped on efforts to elevate other types of objects besides architecture, painting, and sculpture, other types of creators besides trained professional artists, other locations for production besides traditional centers such as London, Paris, or Rome. In retrospect, the problem was that the original impulse legitimately enriched and expanded our discipline, but taken to its extreme, the inclusion of the other resulted in the exclusion of the core canon and then the rejection of the very notion of a canon at all. Of course, appreciation of a work of art is a fundamentally subjective experience, and we might remember that 110 years ago, a fashionable London dinner party not too far from here came to a miserable end when Sir Richard Payne Knight lashed out at Lord Elgin and the marbles he had brought back home from Athens, calling them overrated. The marbles were, Payne Knight went on, not Greek. They are Roman, of the time of Hadrian, when he restored the Parthenon, and even if Greek, by Ictinus and Callicrates, and not by Phidias, who never worked in marble at all, they are perhaps executed by their workmen, hardly higher than journeymen. In other words, if two highly sophisticated art lovers can come to blows over the relative merits of the sculptures of the Parthenon, it is foolish to assert that there is only one criterion by which to judge art. But we have wound up on the opposite extreme by abdicating principles of excellence and standards of judgment, and thereby punishing the objects that have generally been deemed exceptional. Unfortunately, this shift happened at a time when the technology of art history was cumbersome, from the slide libraries, and I admit I still write slide when I have to change an image, and projecting facilities necessary to teach it, to the prohibitive expense of publishing illustrated texts, all of which contributed to an impression of the discipline as unmoored, expensive, and increasingly superfluous. But the digital revolution may well turn this into an opportunity for art history, as widely available free images online can be used in any PowerPoint, and book designers are now basically unfettered in the number and placements of pictures in books. We might seize the opportunity to reassess how we are treating the study of art history and how we might re-enlist canonical objects in the defense of Western civilization. So that is my project, which began with a study of the repeated pattern of intersection between human creativity and democracy that became David's sling, the modest success of which has led to a new project which will be entitled Seeing the Light, A History of Christianity in 12 Works of Art, and which will, God willing, conclude at some future date. I must admit, Professor Bragg, I'm jealous you've completed your trilogy. And this will conclude at some future date with a volume on autobiography and self-portraiture, which will be perfect for the selfie age. With your indulgence, I'd like to look quickly at a case study for each one, all drawn because I am such a modern girl from the 16th century. This is not, however, an accident. I was discussing in an interview yesterday that we appear in 2016 to be in the midst of a paradigm shift. And the host asked if I could think of an equivalent time. And I said, without thinking, the Italian Renaissance. And so it occurred to me they might be instructive for our discussion today. The three items in question are Michelangelo's David, Raphael's Transfiguration, and Cellini's autobiography or Vita. You will be pleased to learn that I do not propose an exhaustive history of all three before lunch, but rather to point out how they have all to some extent lost their way in modern analysis through no fault of their own, and that attention to their original contexts reveals how each represents one of my proposed core tenets of Western civilization. See if I've learned anything. First on our list is Michelangelo's David, generally and correctly proclaimed to be the greatest marble ever carved by the greatest artist who ever lived. The vast preponderance of scholarship on it has focused either on aesthetic concerns regarding its proportions, its nudity, and its idealization, or on issues related to the artist, such as the pronounced psychological turmoil revealed in its face, or the outsized right hand, which is interpreted as a symbolic signature for the titanic hand that carved it. And so it is, but such analysis ignores the other hand, the hand that holds the sling without which David would have met his match. For Florence, that sling was democracy, along with the florin, the first hard currency of Europe, that inspired the city's greatness. This was self-conscious when the Florentine Republic was restored in August of 1501, after all that unpleasantness surrounding Savonarola's theocracy, which had ruined the commerce and creativity of the city. One of the first things the Gonfaloniere of Florence, Piero Soderini, did was commission the David from Michelangelo. And in turn, as you can see on the far screen, Michelangelo inscribed on one of his few surviving preparatory drawings, as David did with his sling, so I do with my bow, making the connection between defending the Republic and carving the David overt. Finally, rather than being placed at the cathedral as originally planned, the figure was set in the front of the town hall, the Palazzo Vecchio, to guard the Republic. So how has this context been so shoved to the background that the last study that seriously considered Michelangelo's politics is Charles de Tolnay's 1964, The Art and Thought of Michelangelo? As it turns out, the attempt to reconstitute the Republic was not a lasting success. 15 years after the David was completed, the first of two Medici popes was sitting on the throne of St. Peter and plotting a return from exile. The family would take control of the city for good in 1530. Michelangelo participated in the final defense and had to go into hiding. Alessandro de' Medici became the first Duke of Florence, and eventually the Medici were the undisputed Grand Dukes of Tuscany. Michelangelo's hiding was brief, however, because the Medici, smartly, did not want to persecute him. They wanted to employ him. Not terribly subtly, they moved into the Palazzo Vecchio so that the seat of the Republic became their house and the David their door warden. For his part, Michelangelo moved to Rome and refused to return to Florence, although he was happy enough to work for the Medici remotely. In his private poetry, however, he mourned the Republic for the rest of his very long life and wished to be buried in Rome. The minute he died in 1564, however, Medici agents sprang into action and spirited the body back to Florence for a magnificent state burial from which all traces of the Republic were banished. The theme of the affair was to establish Michelangelo as the founding father of the Medicean Academy of Art, which is why, when you visit the David today, you find it in the Accademia Museum. Michelangelo, the passionate patriot of the Florentine Republic, did not fit into this narrative, which has persisted to this day. On Good Friday, some 15 years after Michelangelo's David was revealed, the greatest painter in Rome lay on his deathbed. Raphael Sanzio was only 37 years old, and just a few weeks previously had seemed at the height of his powers, the favorite artist of Pope Leo X de' Medici and his powerful younger cousin, Cardinal Giuliano de' Medici. The Pope had, in fact, visited the artist's deathbed in an unprecedented honor. At Raphael's also unprecedented funeral in the Pantheon shortly thereafter, the scene was dominated by the Medici's final commission to him, the Great Transfiguration, that had just become the precious Last Raphael. And so this complex, challenging image has been mined for centuries for evidence of the painter's spiritual and stylistic last phase, and even, due to some of its rather un-Renaissance oddities, condemned as the work of his students. But that always troubled me because, unlike artists such as Titian or Poussin, who had deliberate last works, Raphael had no idea he was about to lay down his brushes. And as it turns out, the Transfiguration actually documents a specific crisis in the Church with dramatic ramifications for our own time, and as such is a vital part of the unique history of Christian art. In short, the Western Mediterranean was, during this period, increasingly bedeviled by pirates under control of the Turks, who, as we have learned, had captured Constantinople in 1453. The then emperor, appropriately titled Selim the Grim, had his eyes on Europe, and particularly on Rome. Some of his most daring raiders almost kidnapped Leto when he was hunting near Ostia in 1515. The Pope took it personally. The Medici also had his historical connection with the surviving Eastern Roman Empire, and Leo conceived of a new crusade that would remove this menace once and for all, and decided that their most Catholic majesties, Francis I of France and the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, should lead it together. Cardinal Giuliano was placed in charge of the project, and he commissioned the Transfiguration from Raphael to be sent to Marseille, which was also a target of the pirates. Francis went on regular travels around his domain and was famously mad for Italian art, and he could be trusted to make a beeline for Marseille as soon as the Raphael arrived. Had it ever been sent, the king would have found in the Transfiguration a call to liberate the Eastern Orthodox Church from the infidel. While extremely rare in Catholic art, the Transfiguration was a seminal event in both Eastern theology and art as the earthly moment when Christ's divinity was revealed. The altarpiece furthermore uniquely fuses this subject with the subsequent failure to heal, forming a narrative of the confused futility of human endeavors, which can all be resolved by a focus on sacred matters, represented by the upper register of the altarpiece, which for Francis would mean liberating Constantinople. Understood thus, the painting's flat composition and confluence of time and space, which is far more typical of Byzantine art than what we consider to be the Renaissance, now makes sense. Giuliano de' Medici, who was a collector of Byzantine manuscripts with images of the Transfiguration and who was planning the new crusade, could have proposed the subject, and his favorite artist, who was considering becoming a cardinal himself at the time, could have given it pictorial form. It then would have been up to Francis to put the pieces together. Except that Raphael died, followed 5 months later, and equally unexpectedly, by Selim. The pressing need to send the precious Last Raphael to France was removed, and the painting began its long career as one of the choicest treasures in Rome, although the Transfiguration did finally make that journey to France in 1798, courtesy of Napoleon Bonaparte. Its religious significance, except as evidence of Raphael's late spirituality, however, has all but been forgotten. Finally, we have the curious case of Benvenuto Cellini, who, as an aging and out-of-work artist under house arrest for corrupting minors in 1558, took the extraordinary step of writing the first full autobiography. Neither autobiography or self-portraiture existed in the ancient world. Phidias, for example, faced criminal charges for the mere rumor that he had included an image of himself on the Athena Parthenos. Both exercises in self-fashioning truly emerged in the 15th century, culminating in Cellini's audacious act, which he claimed that he spontaneously recited to a scribe while working in his shop, because he found the act of writing physically exhausting. But despite the resulting engagingly casual and colloquial style, Cellini crafted a highly artful self-portrait of himself as a quasi-divine creator, the artistic descendant of earlier Renaissance masters, notably Michelangelo and Raphael. The carefully edited surviving manuscript is actually as densely woven and packed with allusions as one of Cellini's statues, and you see here the Perseus with the artist's self-portrait, which is on the back of his helmet on the far screen. A contemporary reader would have immediately recognized his literary references to everything from Augustine to Boethius to Dante's Divine Comedy to the first edition of Giorgio Vasari's Lives of the Most Excellent Painters, Sculptors, and Architects. Cellini's autobiography is actually organized around 3 pairs of works of art: the Chalice of Clement VII, who was our old friend Giuliano de' Medici, elevated to the papacy in 1523, the Mars for Francis I, and the Neptune Fountain for Duke Cosimo de' Medici, all of which were extremely ambitious, but none of which were ever actually created, generally, according to Cellini, because of the bad behavior of his patrons. Each one is followed in the text by 3 of Cellini's best-known works: the Salt Cellar of Francis I, the Florentine Perseus, and the Crucifixion now at the Escorial, which also provide a catalog of the artist's excellence in fine metalwork, bronze, and marble. By establishing and repeating the conceit of a masterwork that exists only in the pages of his autobiography and following it with a great but lesser realized project, Cellini challenges the reader to imagine how great he could have been had he not been constrained by the vagaries of his patrons. Indeed, according to the artist himself, his creative powers approached the divine. It was quite a statement from a man in Cellini's position who had no traditional social pretensions and was the practitioner of a profession that was generally considered a manual pursuit. But Cellini clearly believed his creative genius elevated him above his contemporaries, and that through his autobiography he could craft a lasting image of himself as a hero artist. But even Cellini appears to have concluded that he had gone a little too far, especially if he ever wanted to work again. And after circulating the manuscript to some friends, he ultimately decided not to publish, and the Vita languished, forgotten in the Florentine archives for more than a century. When it finally appeared in print in 1728, the Vita caused a scandal for its salacious content and became a sensation for the Romantics. Goethe translated it into German in 1796, insisting that he was gazing directly into the Renaissance artist's spontaneous and unvarnished soul, an analysis that became so firmly established that Cellini became the poster child for the rebellious avant-garde artists of the modern era. But this was largely due to the accidental publication history of the autobiography. In actuality, Cellini was a pioneer in deliberately and carefully establishing the limitless potential of each individual who could, through God-given talent, rise to the greatest heights of achievement. So in closing, as we look back across the intervening 5 centuries that separate us from Michelangelo, Raphael, and Cellini, we should take heart that liberty, Christianity, and individuality continue to define what we understand as Western civilization. Re-examination of these 3 works suggests that we don't even fully appreciate the heritage of the riches of our heritage. That is not to say, however, that the development of Western civilization is linear, evolutionary, or indeed inevitable. Even in the West, the history of democracy is littered with failure and oppression. Just look at the French. The term crusade has become, not entirely without basis, more or less a dirty word. Far more individuals languish in obscurity than reach the heights of fame and fortune. But the question to us is whether or not we should allow the fact that our ideals are imperfectly realized to force us to renounce them, or if we should be inspired by the achievements of those who came before us to redouble our efforts to do better by them. What happened in Rome last January on the Capitoline is a warning sign that the pendulum is swinging toward renunciation. But in my opinion, this heritage should not be hidden away in shame. It has the potential to elevate us and illuminate our path forward. Illumination I think we could all use as we chart our path into this most unexpected of new years. It should be fiercely protected and celebrated as something aspirational as well as exceptional that can be offered to, but not imposed on, any peoples. We fall asleep on this job at our peril, for as Tocqueville pointed out, those who lose the will to defend their liberty are doomed to surrender it. Thank you.